It is now my pleasure to introduce an exciting panel discussion which will be moderated by Camille Abrams Emeagwali, Vice President of Programs at the New York Women's Foundation, and I'll ask them to join me up here at the panel. During her career, Camille has had extensive experience in nonprofit technical assistance and has provided skill-building training for community-based organizations around development and program sustainability. Her panel will discuss shifting board priorities, including current boardroom trends surrounding leadership development and the implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So I will invite Camille, as well as our other panelists, to come up right now. Hi. Joining Camille for this discussion are Lupita Gonzalez, who's Chief Executive Officer at the Thrive Advisory, Wayne Ho, President and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council, and Pavitra Menon, who is a social change organizational consultant and certified professional coach. Camille, over to you.
Okay, that was a quick transition. Okay, so good morning, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Camille Abrahams Emeagwali. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the New York Women's Foundation. Very excited to be here. Currently, I'm in a role of a funder, have been with the New York Women's Foundation for over 7 years, but prior to that had been working in the capacity building space, providing trainings, technical assistance, working with organizations around the country. So it's very exciting to be here and talk about this issue because I think that for a long time it's been sort of under the surface. And what we have recognized is that, particularly in recent years, we've seen, I think, a groundswell of attention focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, we can begin. So, for us, focusing on our topic, which is shifting board priorities, building diversity, equity, and inclusion, and leadership strength, we're excited to talk about this because we see it as really connected to the theme for today, which is cultural shifts that lead us to embracing new realities. And I think this is particular for boards as well as organizational leadership. I think collectively, this panel probably has decades of experience in different roles, not only as in working in nonprofit organizations as leaders, but also capacity building providers, funders, and even board members themselves. So I think what will be interesting is that folks will be able to talk about not only the current role that they have, but I think different perspectives and different ways in which they have served within the nonprofit sector. And I think the lessons learned will hopefully and shared will hopefully help you as you think about how to strengthen your own leadership and effectiveness as well as that of your board. So when we think about changing times and embracing new realities, in recent years, what we've seen is full frontal racism, the rise of the Me Too movement, aggressive nationalism that has led to fear and anxieties in immigrant communities. And I think what that has led to is really an urgency for organizations and leadership to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion to the conversation around how we move forward within organizations. This urgency, as we all work to advance the well-being, dignity, and justice of our communities, and also center the work of people and what they're doing, I think it's helpful to think about it at the intersections of race, gender, sexual orientation, ableism, the list goes on. And so we want to talk about, and I think really center in this conversation, how we can work effectively by including and holding ourselves accountable to those we serve and those we fight for. And so we hope to be able to tackle those topics today. But before we go into what I think will be an exciting conversation with our panelists, I just want to take a quick poll, if folks can raise their hand, and answer the question, how many of you think you have a diverse board? Oh. Feel free, no, feel proud about that. Yes, there we go. Okay. So then my next question was going to be how many have an inclusive board, but we'll table that for now. And then just go right into the panel. So let's jump into the discussion. What I think would be helpful, because I think our bios are in the packet, but as we go down the line and each member of the panel answers their first question, it would also be helpful if you talk about how you've come to this work and how your work is connected to this topic. So let's start with you, Pavitra. Let's start with just basic definitions. How would you define DEI? And what part should we focus on the most?
Thank you, Camille. My name is Pavitra Menon. I worked with Community Resource Exchange, and I recognize a lot of former clients, partners in the room, so really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I worked with CRE for about 15 years doing consulting, facilitation, training, coaching, and then in the last year or so, I've taken a bit of a step back, working on my own as an affiliate consultant with Community Resource Exchange, but also on my own with organizations outside of the CRE traditional client base. What brings me to this work and what is super exciting about this work is just in working with CRE for the 15 odd years that I did, just seeing the organization itself embrace the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really sort of take a stance in making that our bread and butter in the way we did our consulting, training, coaching, and facilitation work, and then running into all of the challenges that taking such a stance gets us to, right? So on a very superficial level, and I think my co-panelists will get into this a lot deeper into what DEI actually means. But diversity, what does diversity mean? I think, Camille, you started to allude to the various things that make us different and the different perspectives that we bring that might be driven by our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, education, a host of other attributes. The point being that, just honoring all the things that make us different. Equity is about trying to get to the things that eliminate barriers from getting all of our differences to actually be seen and valued, right? And I think the question was, what should we be focusing on most? It is the inclusion piece of it, which most often than not, I think gets thrown to the wayside because people are so focused on checking the boxes, making sure that they have the diversity indicators all marked up. And then if you don't get into inclusion tactics and strategies, if you don't get to creating a space where those diverse voices are valued, pretty much the diversity piece is a tokenism kind of a thing, right? So to me, it feels like getting to strategies around inclusion seems to be the most important thing to get to the equity piece that everyone's driving towards.
Thank you, Pavitra. So Wayne, I'd like to sort of continue on that same conversation. For a long time, the field has focused on diversity. But should we sort of de-emphasize that, stop using diversity, really focus on inclusion? Has diversity lost its power and impact?
So good morning, everybody. Good morning. I want to thank Table 7 being present. Good morning, everybody. All right, so my name is Wayne Ho, and I'm the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council. CPC, we're the largest Asian American social services nonprofit in the country. We're based here in New York. This year is our 55th anniversary. And I come to this work from the policy side, and policy and advocacy is my background, not social services. So it's interesting to be someone who used to run a Pan-Asian advocacy organization where for us, we had to think about not only do we have Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Filipinos in the room, but what about Bangladeshi, Nepali, Indian, Pacific Islander community, Samoan, Hmong, Mien, others that might be smaller emerging communities in New York City, and how do we make sure that they're at the table? So coming over to a service organization where we start off with the name Chinese American, and we were founded in Chinatown in Manhattan, but now we've grown to serve 60,000 New Yorkers a year. 2/3 are Asian, mostly Chinese, The other third represents the diversity of New York, so Black, Latinx, other immigrant and low-income communities. So for me, diversity is still a key term, and it's something that we should use and embrace. But the reality is, what do we mean when we say diversity? And I think it's important for us to name it and call it out. So if we're just using diversity because it's a safe way for us to say that we want more people of color at the table, if we're using diversity because we want to say that we want more women or gender non-conforming folks at the table, if we're saying that we specifically want people with disabilities at the table, LGBTQ populations, we need to be very specific about calling out what do we mean by diversity. But why do we need to move towards inclusion and equity? As a nonprofit, I think that it's always important for us to lead with our values and act with our values. And I find it easier for us to go outside and hold our values externally. We can criticize the mayor, we can criticize the governor, it's easier to criticize the mayor than the governor. The governor then starts tweeting back at you. What do you do? He has an army of interns that actually looks at tweets about him. That's not a joke. So you gotta delete the 10 seconds back. What we need to look at then is, if we're leading with our values, it's always easy to tell other people what to do. But are we going to live our values internally? So if the values that we've created at CPC is about our mission has been updated to serve Chinese Americans, immigrants, and low-income communities, if we have organizational values that explicitly says we are our community, we embrace our community, and we empower our community, how are we doing that from our board to our leadership team to our staff to our line staff? And diversity's in many ways easy, right? Let's open up the dance floor and let everyone out on the dance floor. But what type of music are you playing? What's the pricing of your dance hall that you're letting people in? Who can dance with whom on the dance floor? Who's controlling the music? Who's the DJ? Who's selecting the music selection? Who's actually on the selection committee that determines where the dance is going to happen? That's where diversity in many ways is just getting folks onto the dance floor. It's everything before, during, and after the dance is where we start moving towards equity and inclusion.
Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate the dance example there. We'll come back to that in a minute. Lupita,
We'll come back to me dancing.
Yes, in a minute.
Okay.
Yes, at the end of this. I knew.
Good.
Lupita, I want to actually also sort of bring you into this conversation as well, because I know language is especially key. And we have often seen that now DEI is just sort of packaged together, right? So we're not even just saying diversity anymore. It's DEI, and not really unpacking the three terms. So I want to hear more from you about that, which is, why is language so important in this conversation? And is DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, the right language for this conversation?
Thank you for that question. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Lupita Gonzalez, CEO of the Thrive Advisory. Language is really important. Yes, DEI has become a sexy, hot term these days, right? I want to begin also by stating that I came to the work really early on, being a daughter of Mexican immigrants. So I saw firsthand a lot of the adversity that they had to endure. I began to dedicate my academic and professional life to social justice. And I'm going to be very bold and plain and say DEI is a palatable way to say social justice in organizations. So I think we skirt around the real root issues of the work that we need to do because we've had to make it palatable for some populations. Siblings of color, I know you're in the room here. I see you. And there's a lot of yes. So I think what's really critical is to be very intentional about the words that you use. Quite frankly, I no longer use the term diversity. It means nothing. The work that I do, I'm really dedicated and committed to shifting organizational cultures so that we begin to humanize and learn how to really share power, right? So, the sexy term for sharing power is inclusion, right? I also am trying not to use the word inclusion so much either, because that centers whiteness, right? It's saying we have the authority to include you or not. That's not so cool. So I don't know, we have to come up with a different term, I think, for inclusion. I will say this, I'm going to challenge you to also, I think in the language that we use, it determines the way that we feel and perceive one another. So another thing that I want to challenge you to try on is instead of using the terms minority, let's be a little more accurate and try on the global majority. And this is not my own thinking. This has been already recommended in the past. So what happens when we begin to call ourselves the global majority? There's a shift in the way that we perceive our power and our worth as human beings. Another thing I want to state is that race was simply a construct developed to determine who's human and who is not. So, I lead with race. It's not enough to say that an organization is, let's say, not racist. That's not enough. It's important to claim and make the commitment to be anti-racist. Thank you for the applause. I upset a lot of people.
I don't think you upset people, you woke folks up a little bit, so I appreciate that. But I appreciate you bringing in this idea of shifting, right? I think moving to a place of shifting our language, but also recognizing the shifts that are happening within organizations in and of themselves, right? So we are talking also about generational shifts even in leadership. We're seeing many organizations, a lot of older organizations that have been around for a long time, having white male leadership, most moving into a place of retirement, seeing the pipeline of leadership that's moving towards folks that are of color, women, different levels of ableism, all kinds of things. Thinking about that, how does the increased diversity, but I think the recognition of the shifting in who is moving into the pipelines of leadership impact organizations and having this conversation? So how can we be thinking about this landscape, recognizing that these shifts are changing within organizations right now? So Pavi, maybe you can jump into that.
Sure. And I think Lupita started to allude to this. And let's be frank about it. Diversification requires a redistribution of power. Mm-hmm. I mean, it basically starts, and that's where the narrative has to begin. And it requires every organization, and since we're talking about boards to really begin to start looking at themselves and really asking the tough questions about what it means to redistribute power. And I think at the level that organizations are right now in the movement of getting to a more equitable place, we're sort of, at least from my experience, I see we're still very much stuck in the let's check off the boxes and make sure we have the numbers that satisfy either a funder or whoever it is that we're holding ourselves accountable to, without actually having the real honest conversations of being truly inclusive or truly equitable, which requires a re-examination of where the power is held. In Wayne's analogy, I mean, who is the DJ? Who is the person that actually controls, sort of what happens on that dance floor? And how does that redistribution or reshift take place? It will require everybody getting a little bit uncomfortable, and we all know that we get, we don't want to go there. So I think for us, really for boards to really sit back and have conversations about what it means to redistribute power, what it means to shift that narrative, what it's going to take from them to make that happen, which may in some cases be stepping off the board, I venture to say, but to really begin to push that envelope a little bit.
So, Wayne, why should we start with the board?
I hate this question.
Change the question.
No, it's okay. Was it last time I spoke on this panel, which maybe was 5-6 years ago? I was pretty critical of boards. I still remain critical of boards for nonprofit organizations. So, having said that, at the end of the day, governance, strategy, policy is all dictated by the board. It should be dictated by the board. And a lot of the marching orders, the goals, the vision, and the impacts ultimately that we want to make as an organization falls on the board. So if the board does not buy in, whatever language you use, whether you want to say anti-racist, whether you want to use DEI, whether you want to use the term white supremacy, which has been redefined in the last couple of years, depending on how far you want to push it with the board, if your board does not support the effort, at the end of the day, in my mind, it's not going to stick. Unless you have an executive director and a leadership team that have the allies throughout your organization that is willing to continue championing it and knowing that it's going to take a couple of years to move your board along, and at some point maybe your board members will turn over and you'll figure out the right time to have a board retreat and you'll bring up the issue. So having said that, I think at most times it depends on how old your organization is and where your board is at, and whether or not you're going to have these conversations. So I think that, for example, if Lupita came into I shouldn't say mine, but I think it's true. If Lupita came into some board meetings and said what she just said, 2 minutes later, the one hard question will be asked, she'll be kicked out of the board meeting, and then we'll go back into our financial report.
It has happened.
Yeah, right. Like, that's what's going to happen. And I think my feeling has always been we need to meet people where they're at, but we do need to know the levers of where to push. And you need to find, and Keith talked about it and Kelsey talked about it earlier, which is you need to find the right allies on the board who does have a larger view than just self-sustaining your board of directors in order to do the move. And we'll have a longer conversation later, but I think there is a difference between organizations that were created as quote-unquote non-racial organizations, which in my mind are more white-led organizations or historically been white-serving organizations, and most of their line staff and community members are people of color or some other group of the global majority. And so most of the board members are white and richer and maler, versus organizations like mine that were created on for a specific community. And if we're going to talk about DEI with a board that started in Chinatown, still has Chinese American in its name, and has a majority Chinese board, DEI looks, feels, and plays itself out very, very differently.
We'll definitely come back to that. I want to sort of bring Lupita back in because I think, we talk about this journey to DEI or even sort of shifting or expanding the language around anti-racism work and shifting power work with a board. What should that look like? So as a board or even an executive director is beginning to contemplate this journey towards that, what should that framing, what should that look like in that description?
Yeah, I wanna stress that we have a major racial leadership gap in our nonprofit sector. I mean, we have the data. We all know, right? You ask anybody and it's like, what's the majority of boards? White males, right? It's a given. Why are we gonna be skirting around? Why are we gonna be shy and not call things for what they are? Okay, well, I know why, right? We fear our jobs might be at stake. We fear, there's real power in challenging, speaking truth to power, right? But here's my challenge. I think that there needs to be this normative language that happens, right? We need to, as you said earlier, if there's terms like white supremacy, right? Marginalization, oppression, all of those concepts and terms, we need to normalize the usage of these concepts, because these are going to be the tools and foundation so that we can have meaningful conversation, critical, real conversations about how do we dismantle racism in our boards, right? And help to shift some of that power. So I think it's critical to normalize these terms and concepts. Yeah, it's not easy, it never is, and I always am very bold, and yes, I have been kicked out of a couple of places. But you know what? My thought is at least I agitated and planted a seed. Who knows what will happen later? But my job, I'm not in it for me, I'm in it for affecting change. So I think if we all collectively push the envelope just a bit more, maybe we can get to more progress on that front.
So Pavitra, I want to kind of bring in this idea that Wayne mentioned of sort of meeting board members where they're at, right? Mm-hmm. And recognizing that when even broaching this conversation around DEI, they may instantly begin to think about certain challenges and barriers. And recognizing your experience in working with a lot of organizations around this, maybe you can name some of the challenges or barriers that boards may feel they have around going on this journey towards diversity, equity, inclusion, sort of beginning the power sharing conversation.
So I can speak from a real sort of case study which our organization went through, and a lot of it boils down to the lack of awareness and education, I think, and when I say awareness and education, I mean at a deeper level. I think everyone is aware and educated at a very superficial level as to what DEI means and sort of what it means for everybody else. But when it comes to what does it mean for us, there needs to be sort of a deeper conversation as to how do these principles, how do these concepts apply to us, and how can we hold a mirror up to ourselves and see if we are truly indeed upholding the principles that we are now learning about. So I do believe, I think the previous panel, they also alluded to having a lot of training, conversation, opening up doors for this type of dialogue to even begin to happen in the boardroom. And moving, in as much as the financial reporting and the strategic plan is important, how can we weave in principles of equity and inclusion into our everyday life and strategy, which also includes how does the board operate moving forward. So starting with a place of, even if it is going to, or bringing in an anti-racist training organization into the boardroom to do some conversation could be the first place to start. But I think it definitely does go deeper than that. And at the risk of sounding like I'm promoting myself, talking to coaches, people that have worked with boards, who have moved boards along a continuum to get to a place of equity and inclusion, to really examine people's own personal paradigms and preferences, and not to sort of call people out as being racist or being bad or being whatever the derogatory term is, but to really have folks examine where they're coming from, why are they affiliated with an organization such as the one that they're affiliated with, how do they affiliate with the communities that the organization serves, what are the differences, what are the similarities. Like having a space to dialogue about all of that will probably be sort of the very, very first step in moving and educating folks along a continuum that we want them to get to.
May I add?
Absolutely.
That's great. Yes, absolutely. So here's another thing that I've learned through my years of working with different organizations, and that is to say that I've had a couple of clients approach me after they've gone through a very intensive DEI initiative after a 1-2 year. They were left open and raw. They called me back and they were like, Lupita, help us come back together again and heal. So here's the thing too. It's really critical to, I know that we're organizational development practitioners and organizational change, but also I think it's important to really have strong insight on the way that our individual stuff plays out. There's a study, it's a focus called sociometry. Sociometry is a study looking at the way that different relationships in an organization, right, impact, influence, shape the organization. I think sometimes what we leave out when we've been so formally trained in organizational development concepts, for example, is that sometimes we have our own individual personalized traumas and we play it out in the organizations. And we'll link it to larger things. I'll give an example. Just yesterday I was coaching an executive director of a national organization, and they are going through a DEI initiative. One of their tasks was to have the employee resource committee or group to really begin reshaping, thinking about what should management's role be, right, in DEI work, and more specifically, how would they best be able, what is their role or to show up in different meetings around DEI? So the executive director was asked to not be in those discussions, right? So in my one-on-one coaching with her, she came in and she's like, I feel so hurt. I feel really excluded. So we had this really deep coaching one-on-one, and I asked her, when have you felt like that before? And of course, it took her back to when she was 8 years old. And she was always left out, always the last one picked, So she had really, really deep feelings about this. And then when she was able to recognize, some of this is my stuff, it's old stuff, then it just, aired it out. And then she's like, oh, I don't feel so bad anymore. I trust my staff. I know they're doing good work. It's okay. So had she not, had coaching or some resources to really help her think through what's going on with me, I think sometimes as leaders, we react, right? And then that may not serve you or staff. But anyway, in DEI work, there is so many emotions, triggers, hurt feelings, OMG, the list is long. So it is so critical, as Pavitra said, that there's a lot of coaching, one-on-one coaching with individuals, but then also coaching with groups so they can stay authentic and focused to what's really happening. As things come up, be able to address them and really work it out.
Thank you. Wayne, I appreciate this sort of line where we're kind of giving real examples, because I think that also is helpful for folks to kind of think about this and contextualize it for their own organization. And I think particularly around organizations that you walk into that are not having the conversation yet. And so when we think about an organization there who's in that place, whose role is it to shift the priorities to focus on DEI? And where does that power reside to make this shift?
So part of the reason I'm critical about boards is because I feel like the experts in the room are the staff. And it really comes down to whether you call us executive directors, presidents, CEOs, we're all the same, right? We're the organizational heads. So I think any initiative, whether it's us focusing more on outcomes than outputs, whether it's us growing a program, whether it's us wanting to infuse money and invest in Salesforce, to promoting diversity, equity, inclusion. I'll just use the term because it's quicker. It comes down to the executive director to be the one to put it on the table and live it out, train the staff, support the staff, and build it. I do think that you need to sequence it properly, though. So for CPC, I would have never joined CPC. I've known CPC even before I moved to New York 16 years ago, but I would have never joined CPC 3 years ago if they'd never updated their mission. So before I joined, the mission was to promote the social and economic empowerment of Chinese Americans in New York. That was it. They went through a strategic planning process 2 years before I joined as part of their search process, and they broadened the mission statement to specifically say, to name out Chinese Americans, immigrant, and low-income New Yorkers. And a lot of that was because the staff who participated in the strategic planning process kept pushing that, look at our leadership team, look at our staff, look at our community members. It's not just Chinese. Look at the neighborhoods we're in, whether due to immigration, residential patterns, or gentrification. It's not just Chinese. So we need to recognize this as part of the mission. So by having the mission there, it opened up the opportunity then to say, okay, what does this really mean if we're gonna do more than just serve Chinese Americans? So when I joined, I had the opportunity to lead and add on to our strategic planning process. So the board's strategic plan, the strategic plan I inherited was specifically around infrastructural issues and operational issues. They left programmatic and staff issues to the new ED. So that's where I took it as my opportunity. Okay, I'm gonna put my stamp on this thing. So for the first time ever, CPC had organizational values. And we built in this issue around equity and inclusion and diversity around it. For the first time, we were able to have vision statements and a theory of change where we explicitly called out this work. We had the opportunity to look at our programs and actually come up with a database on looking at our staff and our community members. CPC has 5,200 staff. I know 25 names, but we have 5,200 staff. 3,000 are not Asian American. 3,000. So that means 60% of my staff are not Asian, let alone Chinese. So as part of this work is having values, looking at actually what the demographics are of the 60,000 we serve, the 5,200 we employ, and then mapping out our programs. How do we then uphold this? So I'm just going to jump ahead to another question around what do you do as a ethnic-based organization? Okay. So if you're going to shift the priorities of the board, I do think it's fundamental to do professional development, have these hard conversations, but you need to be able to anchor on something. So whether that's your organizational values or your mission statement or your program goals. So as a Chinese organization, and we started building out our policy and advocacy and civic engagement work, our board was so excited because our lobbying efforts got us more city council and state funding. They're excited about that. And then they came to me and said, oh, the mayor wants to build or expand a jail in Chinatown. We need to protest the closing of Rikers because they don't invest in China. The mayor or the city doesn't invest in Chinatown. We need to protest this jail. They also came to me at some point and said, specialized high school admissions. The mayor wants to change it. It's going to lower the number of Asians in specialized high schools. We as CPC, if you're doing more policy work, we need to protest that. And the list goes on. I can give you plenty of examples. But I always came back to the table and said, well, who is our base and what does our values say? Because our values are not saying we will promote to the ends of the earth Chinese American interests. We are here to embrace and empower our community, which is Chinese, Asian, and other communities of color and immigrant communities. So how do we not, and on a practical side then, how do we not lose our historical base of the 5 Chinatowns in New York, who are our biggest donors, friends with our board members. By the way, my founder's still on my board. And how do we manage our legacy with also who we are as an organization the last 3 years? And that's why we were able to have this conversation around Rikers does need to close. There needs to be criminal justice reform. Folks who live in the 5 Chinatowns are not just Chinese anymore. And this is how we're going to engage with criminal justice reform as CPC. Similarly with specialized high schools. we had to navigate that whole history of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans feeling like they were left out of the process, which, by the way, they were left out of the process. We were left out of the process, but that doesn't mean the outcomes of kids of color getting into the specialized high schools is something that we should perpetuate as an organization. And these are hard conversations to have with your founder and with your board, but we could have never had it if we never updated our mission, our vision, our theory of change, and our organizational values, and remind the board constantly in all of our board meetings about how our values are playing out in our programmatic and policy work.
Thank you. Pavitra, I would like you to kind of talk a little bit about kind of shifting back to the conversation around leading this effort. And oftentimes you'll have this example in which it may be a person of color, whether it's an executive director or a member of the board who may be the sole person in the board, being tasked or feeling tasked to actually be the one to sort of take the charge in leading this effort around what the organization, particularly the board, should be doing to bring a DEI lens to their work and to their board. So should people of color within an organization be the ones leading the effort, or vice versa, sort of with Wayne's example, those who have felt like they are not part of the dominant group feel like they're the ones that are leading the charge? Is it an individual or is it systems?
Absolutely is the systems, right? Like, I mean, you cannot place the burden of making change for the population that is most disenfranchised to begin with, right? On that population. You cannot make them the carriers. And oftentimes, again, going back to the initial conversation that we had around diversity, if the board is only looking at diversity from the point of view of, okay, we need 2 people of color on our board, and now we have the 2. Now let's make them do all of the work to change the culture of the organization and bring us to the inclusion and equity place. It doesn't work that way, right? So oftentimes we'll say, as consultants, we'll say focus on the systems work first. Don't place the burden on individuals, be it the individuals of the global majority or otherwise, to be the sole change bearers. Focus on your organizational systems, and a great place to focus to start with is recruitment, whether it be recruitment on the board or recruitment on your staff or of your leadership team. Examine your recruitment systems to see where you're recruiting from. I had a conversation with a leader the other day that was struggling to hire their new talent executive. This is for a very large organization, so they were looking into the corporate sector and had executives from Macy's and 2 other corporations to take on as in their final pool. And I said, how did you get to these candidates? How did you? Oh, we used word of mouth, and we activated our networks, and my board members did whatever they needed to do. And who were these people? They were all sort of connecting with people that they knew, that looked just like them, that had the educational and societal standards that they did. And so they hadn't gotten to the diverse pool that they were actually going for. And so really, breaking some things like that down and looking at, where do you recruit from? How do you get the word out? Where are you posting? Who is making that ask? And then once you do have a set of diverse candidates, hopefully, who's interviewing them? I think it was Keith maybe that mentioned that when he went to his interview, 5 rounds of interview, he was interviewed by all white board members. Does that make it feel comfortable for a person that is coming in, that you're explicitly recruiting for to be a diverse candidate? Does that make anybody feel comfortable? So really re-examining your systems and not placing the burden on the 1 or 2 or 5 of the global majority that you want to, really taking the onus of shaping your systems, creating the right kind of policies, starting with things like recruitment, orientation, and then moving on to more things like retention and so forth, but changing the systems to be more friendly towards getting to your equity and inclusion goals.
Great. So, Lupita, I'm going to ask you a question, and then maybe we'll take a step back here and then ask some of the questions from the audience. One of the things as we were talking and preparing for this panel that came up that I thought was interesting is how we can work with individuals and communities that have typically been in the seat of power to step back and allow others to take space. And so, I'm curious, based on your work, what have been some of the strategies and tactics to help folks? Because again, this is, I think, a journey. So there's the opening of the door, and now it's like moving that work forward. But how do you support people in stepping back?
Do you have an hour?
You got 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, helping people step back. Wow. Yeah, we've been, as a industry, right? We've been trying to nudge that for a few years, quite a number of years. A couple things. What I find is really helpful, and I don't know if you may agree or not, Pavitra, but I think after the systems work, there's a lot of the resistance still comes up in the interpersonal. Mm-hmm. And a ton of biases, unchecked biases. Those are the real, you know how they say the devil's in the details? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You can have all of these, nice processes and modified systems, but you still have to try to account for the biases. So what I do is I kind of encourage people to, after some one-on-one coaching with a lot of the individuals in leadership, we open it up. We have what I call truth and healing circles. So truth and healing circles are when there's a lot of preparation before you actually have the truth and healing circles, but you actually get folks to arrive to a place where they can be open enough to really listen to folks who are experiencing, right, some of the racism or oppression in the organization. At times it might even be some constituents of who the organization serves. Or maybe even peers on the board. So in Truth and Healing Circles, you really just open a safe space for people to share how, when a certain behavior takes place, what the impact is, right, on their work, on their person, confidence, whatever. And then there's after that is stated, then the next thing is the person would say, the ideal would be, right? And then the other person, after listening, could also share how they hope to shift and maybe supports they need to shift, right? So these things are done over and over again, and little by little, it's kind of like a skills-based learning. You begin to really treat each other with much more intimacy and respect, and you begin to see that we're just human beings wanting to belong. That's it. It seems so simple, but so many interpretations, assumptions, and previous traumas and all these other things get in the way. So that's a tool that I use a lot that really, really helps.
So I'm going to pose 2 questions, and maybe you all can jump in wherever you think you have something to share. One, can anyone talk about Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectional theory and how it sort of is intertwined in this conversation, how it plays out in the DEI work, especially in philanthropy? And also, a specific example of how important is socioeconomic status in talking about diversity? And so given that many nonprofits are serving individuals from the low-income sector, how does that issue translate to diversity in organizational leadership?
Can you repeat that one more time? That's
Sure.
a long question.
Yeah, so it was basically, specifically thinking about socioeconomic status as part of the diversity sort of bucket, and thinking about nonprofits that serve individuals from the low-income sector. How does that issue translate to diversity in organizational leadership? So I'm reading that as socioeconomic status maybe being a sort of factor of diversity, something that you look for.
So I can get started, and then hopefully you guys will jump in, because it's a larger topic around intersection, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, there are so many different factors that play into putting together a strategy that will get us to ultimate inclusion and equity, right? And the work, I think we can all agree, is never done. It's just an ongoing iterative cycle. Something new will always come up that requires us to pivot and shift. And so to the extent that we were talking about, ultimately it is about dismantling who holds the power. If our boards, for example, are, and we have policies on our board that require those that drive the governance of our institutions as well as our mission, vision, and hold us to account and have the power. If what it takes to get on those boards is to be of a social economic strata, or you can't be on the board because you can't make the give, get, etc., it's going to automatically alienate a number of people that basically mirror the communities that we serve. So what would it take then to take a step back and see how do we dismantle that so that we can make it more inclusive for those people that don't have the ability or the capability or the capacity to give the $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000, but have something else that they can bring to the board that is equally, if not more valuable than the monetary contributions of their peers, right? So it involves that conversation about thinking through who holds the power, how do we dismantle that, how do we share that, how do we collaborate more instead of controlling, and how do we allow for people with different abilities, capabilities, to be on our boards that inherently, until we can reimagine what our nonprofit governance structure is going to look like. For now, the board is our governing body. How can we make that a more inclusive place for people of all, whatever markers that we want to bring on?
Okay. Combine these two questions. Can the panel provide examples of what leading with values looks like? And also, can you share some of the specific tactics around changing organizational culture towards social justice and inclusion? So thinking about like HR practices, internal communications, hiring, decision-making, things like that.
Sure. So there's one of the things that I help clients with is, for example, the hiring practices. So I'll help them devise what we call a decision guide. And it's not rocket science, it's really simple. All it is, it's a list of questions, right? So let's say for the hiring manager, let's say that they have 3 candidates they're about to interview. This decision guide will help them kind of check their bias. Let's say they interview a candidate. The interview is over. So then the hiring manager will pull out this decision guide and go down the questions one by one. Questions will be as simple as, this candidate shared the same ethnicity as me. Yes or no? Check the box, right? Next question. This candidate shared the same gender as me. Check the box, yes or no. And just, questions very simple questions. But at the end of it, guess what? The hiring manager will be able to take a look at it and be like, oh, no wonder I was really liking that candidate or favoring this candidate or not liking this candidate, right? It helps you try to bring your biases to the forefront and check. Keep yourself in check, right? And then you do that with all the candidates, and then you're able to be a little bit more objective. Okay. So that's one of the tools.
In terms of tools, and I forget the name of it, I can email it back and you guys can get in the follow-up. So there's actually a change management tool that is on an XY axis. And the XY is to the extent there's agreement in the organization on goals and agreement on strategies. So the reason I bring it up is I think most times when we think about organizational change, we say strategic planning, or if you want to make have a staff member be better, we're going to put them on a corrective action plan. But the reality is if you map out whether you're high, high, low, low, high, low, low, high along these two axes, sometimes cultural change around folklore and stories and comparisons of what others are doing can actually move folks, like your founder who's been on your board for 55 years, around change. So, and there's other times where if you're very low on both strategy and goals, in agreement on both, it's actually more about being more directive. You got to do fiat, you got to negotiate. So there's different tools, and I can forward it on. But I think to the example is how can you be more inclusive? So at CPC, it wasn't just about us being inclusive, and we have been around the Chinese American community. So making sure that things are always translated when we speak in Cantonese and Mandarin, Fujianese, Toisanese, and others. But as we started diversifying, how do we make sure our signage includes Spanish and other languages? A couple years ago when I joined and we changed bathroom signage and added pronouns to our emails, and as part of our introductions now, we're trying to normalize doing pronouns as our introductions. We're trying to start enforcing that at all internal meetings too, that every time we do it, regardless of whether or not we've know everybody in the room or not. On our job applications, where early on we have a pronoun box that you can fill out in the job application. I think in many ways these are signals to the community and signals to staff and signals to potential staff that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible. I think the hardest comes down to actual day-to-day interactions. I remember early on when we started doing pronouns at our all-staff meetings, and we never had all-staff meetings, by the way, until a couple of years ago, but that's about 350 to 400 folks, and Brenda Choi from my strategy team is here and manages those. I remember when we did introductions around the table, because folks don't know each other, we're across 35 sites. I remember when we started doing gender pronouns, 2 immigrants, probably in their 60s, who have been on staff for 30-some years, said, "I'm so-and-so, I'm a man." And the next person said, "I'm so-and-so, I'm a woman." And I think part of it is this idea of racial humility, where I think it's very easy, and the 2 other people at the table, by the way, were openly presenting as gender nonconforming, and they introduced first and used they as their pronouns. And I was at the table when that happened, and in my mind, it's like, you got 2 immigrant folks, which by the way, in Chinese, there's no such thing as gender pronouns. All pronouns are they. So when you learn English, you got to turn to think about gender pronouns, he, she's. And then all of a sudden, we're trying to turn it back to like, no, now you got to have the different pronouns. So I think that's where in some ways is that it's very easy to, and I had to call it out, but I had to call out in a way that wasn't that I'm going to shut you down because you messed up and you have to do it this way. But I think that it is a learning opportunity, that there has to be humility, that we need to catch ourselves, that people might not have the worst intentions or bad intentions, but there are biases and microaggressions and things that happen, and how do we use it as a learning opportunity? And you as the leader of an organization have to be able to be skilled enough to navigate it. I can honestly say I was really shocked when it happened, and I was trying to figure out the right way to do it, but I had to do it. But I think it's things like that, which is we can do the policies and we do everything else, but what can we do to really build a culture of interaction that is respectful and inclusive?
I feel like we had so much more to talk about, but I know we are coming to end our time. I do want to sort of read the questions that actually came up around challenges, even though we won't be able to get to it, because I want you all to hear some of the things that folks are thinking about as they are trying to figure out how to move this work in their own organization. So we have, for example, resources are tight, how to approach DEI work internally without the luxury of consultants and coaches. Describing cases in which board members had to redistribute or relinquish power in the name of inclusion. How did that go? How do mandatory give-get policies affect board equity and inclusion? And how do we not focus the training on the lowest common denominator in the room? So I want to thank our panelists. If they have one last thought to share before we close, anything about what we should be thinking about, why this work is important before we close.
Humility, loved that. Thank you, Wayne. And I would say global majority. Global majority. Let's just, humanize the workplace, y'all. That's it.
I'd say get comfortable being uncomfortable. This is not a result of anything any one of us singularly did in this room. We're not at this place because any one particular individual brought us here. It's generations of unlearning that we need to do. And that's going to take us all to be resilient and a little bit uncomfortable before we can get comfortable.
If it's important, you'll figure out a way to resource it. Whether that's finding pro bono folks or whether or not that's changing some of your budget lines, but if it's important, you'll do it. I've run a 5-person nonprofit with a $350,000 budget. I now run a 5,200 staff member organization with hundreds of $1 million budget. We can find the resources to make it work.
And on that note, I want to thank our panelists with a round of applause.
Lupita, Pavrita, Wayne, Camille, thank you so much. There is just so much to talk about, and actually, Luana, it's another thought for another program. Okay, number one, I want to thank all of you for being here today. You know, one of the things that we do, as I said earlier, our board made a decision a long time ago that our, quote, give-get is just simply saying when I talk to potential board members, it's I need you to bring resources to the table. Resources, I said, we like money, but you know, it's resources that you bring. It could be space, it could be expertise, it could be a lot of things. But that was a decision that came originally from the board, and it allows me as the CEO to then go about and try to create programs like this, again, without money necessarily being the obstacle that you have to jump over, because we, again, underwrite these programs in that way. So once your board makes the decision on what the margin is for your organization, and yes, nonprofits can have a margin, whatever that margin is, then you have a plan that you can go and implement. So, and with that, I'll stop my side of it. But basically, I want to thank all of you very much. I want to thank all of our speakers today. They were magnificent and had so much to say, and we have so much to learn. A big thank you to our underwriters, our sponsors, American Express, the New York Community Trust, Fiscal Management Associates, PMP Staffing Group, and PricewaterhouseCoopers New York, our program committee, who are amazing. And I want you to put this date down, February 23rd, 2021. That's when we do this again. And we hope to see you there. And lots of people that you will let know about us. And March 26th, the program that we talked about earlier for the 990, it's all part of this symposium series. It used to be just the one day, but it's broadened out to a number of seminars throughout the year. So the next one being on March 26th, all about your 990. EisnerAmper is the leader on that. And then on April 29th, Dynamic Duo, Board and Staff Practices for Success, again led by EisnerAmper. And there's always an end, right? And we'll also present workshops about nonprofit leadership issues on September 24th and October 28th, again, generously sponsored by American Express, that we'll be announcing in the future. The symposium evaluations that you have in your kit, we really read them, we really look at them, so please take a moment, fill them out. There's an evaluation tray out front. I hope that this morning has been rewarding for you. I hope it's gotten you thinking more in ways that maybe you hadn't before. And for those of you that have thought about it before, you're building on it and making this happen for the community, because we're going to make it happen. It's all of us in this room that are going to make it happen. So we just need to keep plodding on and helping others be aware of what we have learned today. And again, I'm not saying you just learned it today, but that are building on what we learned today. I want to thank Luana again for her imagination and creativity in helping to put these programs together, and all of you. And with that, have a great day.